In the heart of the dense blackwood forest, where ancient trees whispered secrets to the wind, a secluded cabin stood untouched by time. The cabin was the subject of countless local legend stories of people who entered the woods and were never seen again. Most residents of the nearby town of Briar Ridge avoided the forest, but not everyone heeded the warnings. One crisp autumn evening, for friends Ethan, Claire, Mark, and Jessica received an invitation to spend the weekend at the cabin. The invitation was anonymous, but it promised a weekend of adventure and mystery. Curious and eager for a break from their mundane lives, the friends decided to accept the challenge. They set out for the cabin, their excitement masking the unease that settled in their stomachs as they ventured deeper into the forest. As the group approached the cabin, a sense of foreboding washed over them. The structure was old, with weathered wood and broken windows that seemed to gaze at them like empty, soulless eyes. The forest around them was unnaturally silent, and even the birds seemed to have fled from the darkness that hung over the place. Despite their apprehension, they entered the cabin. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of damp wood and something metallic, like old blood. A thick layer of dust covered the furniture, and cobwebs clung to every corner. It was as if no one had set foot in the cabin for decades. They set up camp, trying to ignore the oppressive atmosphere. But as night fell, the sense of dread grew stronger. Shadows seemed to move on their own, and the wind outside howled like a mournful spirit. That night, the friends gathered around the fireplace, trying to shake off the eerie feeling that had settled over them. They told stories, laughed, and tried to convince themselves that everything was fine. But as the hours ticked by, the laughter faded, replaced by uneasy silence. As midnight approached, the wind outside intensified, and the cabin's old wooden beams groaned under the pressure. The temperature dropped, and a chill filled the room. Suddenly, the fire in the hearth flickered out, plunging them into darkness. Then, they heard a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from the very walls of the cabin. "Get out," it said, the words barely audible yet unmistakable. The friends froze, their hearts pounding in their chests. "Did you hear that?" Claire whispered, her voice trembling. Before anyone could respond, the whisper came again, louder this time, and with it, the sound of footsteps approaching from the hallway. Panicked, the group scrambled to relight the fire. As the flames flickered back to life, the footsteps stopped, but the whispering continued, growing fainter until it faded away entirely. "There's something wrong with this place," Jessica said, her voice shaking. "We need to leave." But when they tried to open the front door, they found it locked. No matter how hard they pulled or how much force they applied, it wouldn't budge. They were trapped. Desperate for answers, Ethan began searching the cabin for any clues about what was happening. In the corner of the living room, he found an old, tattered rug. When he pulled it back, he discovered a trapdoor hidden beneath it. "Look at this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. The others gathered around as Ethan pried the trapdoor open, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. Without another word, they grabbed flashlights and cautiously made their way down. The staircase led them into a cold, damp cellar that smelled of mildew and rot. The walls were lined with old wooden shelves, filled with jars of preserved food, now long spoiled. But what caught their attention was a door at the far end of the room. It was a thick, iron door, out of place in the rustic cabin. Rusted chains hung loosely from it, and an old, padlocked latch secured it shut. Beside the door was a small table, upon which lay a single, dusty key. With a sense of dread, Ethan picked up the key and, with shaking hands, unlocked the padlock. The chains fell away, and the door creaked open, revealing a narrow tunnel beyond. The tunnel walls were lined with strange symbols, painted in what looked like dried blood. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the further they walked, the more their fear grew. At the end of the tunnel, the group found themselves in a large, underground chamber. The room was circular, with a stone altar at its center. The walls were covered in more of the strange symbols, and the floor was stained with what could only be blood. On the altar lay a book, bound in what appeared to be human skin. The cover was marked with the same symbols that adorned the walls. As Ethan approached it, a cold draft swept through the room, extinguishing their flashlights. In the darkness, they heard the whispers again, louder this time, and filled with malice. "You shouldn't have come here," the voices hissed. Terrified, Ethan opened the book, hoping to find anything that could explain what was happening. But as he read the first line, a voice in his head screamed at him to stop. Terrified, Ethan opened the book, hoping to find anything that could explain what was happening. But as he read the first line, a voice in his head screamed at him to stop. As Ethan read the incantation aloud, the chamber began to tremble. The symbols on the walls glowed with an eerie red light, and the whispers turned into screams. The air grew thick with the scent of sulfur, and a deep, guttural growl filled the room. Before they could react, a shadowy figure emerged from the altar. It was tall, with long, bony limbs and hollow, glowing eyes. The figure reached out with clawed hands, and the friends could feel their strength draining away. "We need to get out of here," Mark shouted, but it was too late. The figure lunged at them, moving faster than they could react. It grabbed Claire by the throat, lifting her off the ground with ease. Her screams echoed through the chamber as the life was drained from her, leaving her body limp and lifeless. The others watched in horror, too paralyzed with fear to move. The figure then turned its gaze on them, its eyes glowing brighter as it fed on their terror. But just as it was about to strike again, the chamber was filled with a blinding light. The figure recoiled, hissing in pain, and for a moment, the friends were able to move. Without thinking, they ran back up the tunnel, through the cellar, and up the stairs to the cabin. They didn't stop until they were outside, gasping for breath in the cold night air. The cabin, now glowing with an unnatural red light, seemed to pulse with malevolence. The ground beneath their feet trembled, and the trees around them swayed as if alive. They knew they had to get far away, but the forest had become a labyrinth, the paths twisting and turning in ways they didn't recognize. Panic set in as they realized they were lost. The darkness closed in around them, and the whispers returned, this time from all directions. It was as if the very forest was alive, hunting them down. Jessica, too frightened to continue, fell to her knees, crying out in despair. But Ethan and Mark grabbed her arms, pulling her to her feet. "We have to keep moving," Ethan urged, though his own voice shook with fear. They eventually found a narrow path that seemed familiar. Exhausted and terrified, they followed it, hoping it would lead them back to the town. But as they walked, the forest grew denser, the trees closing in around them. Finally, they broke through the tree line, only to find themselves back at the cabin. The realization hit them like a punch to the gut. No matter how far they ran, the forest would always bring them back. Defeated and desperate, they entered the cabin once more, hoping to find some way to end the nightmare. The cabin was no longer just an old building. It was a trap, a living entity that had lured them in. It was now toying with them. Back in the cabin, Ethan remembered the book in the ritual room. It was their only hope. If the ritual had unleashed the curse, then perhaps it could also be used to stop it. They returned to the underground chamber, where the figure still lurked, waiting for them. With no other choice, Ethan opened the book again, flipping through the pages until he found a counter-ritual. But the ritual required a sacrifice. One of them would have to give their life to save the others. The friends stared at each other in horror, realizing the terrible choice they faced. Ethan, feeling responsible for leading them into this nightmare, volunteered. "This is my fault," he said, his voice heavy with guilt. "I have to fix it." Jessica and Mark protested, but Ethan was resolute. He began reciting the words of the ritual, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. The chamber trembled again, and the figure growled in anger. As Ethan completed the incantation, the figure lunged at him, its claws sinking into his flesh. Ethan cried out in pain, but he didn't stop. With his last breath, he finished the ritual, and the chamber was filled with a blinding light. The figure screamed in agony as it was pulled back into the altar, the light consuming it. The symbols on the walls dimmed and then faded away, leaving the chamber in darkness once more. Jessica and Mark stood in stunned silence, their hearts heavy with grief. Ethan's body lay motionless on the floor, his sacrifice having saved them all. But as the light faded, they realized something was wrong. The whispers had returned, faint but growing louder. The ground trembled again, and the red glow returned to the symbols on the walls. The ritual hadn't ended the curse, it had only angered the entity. The cabin was a trap, and the forest was its prison. No matter how many times they tried to escape, they would always be brought back. As the realization set in, the friends felt a deep despair wash over them. They were trapped in an endless nightmare, with no hope of escape. Mark, driven to madness by the horror of it all, grabbed the book and threw it into the fire. But instead of burning, the flames turned a sickly green, and the book reappeared on the altar, as if mocking them. Determined to fight back, Jessica and Mark searched the cabin for anything they could use to destroy the book. They found an old axe, rusted but still sharp, and decided to try and destroy the altar itself. As they swung the axe at the altar, the cabin shook violently. The figure reappeared, more monstrous than before, its rage palpable. But the friends were beyond fear. They were determined to end the curse, even if it meant their own deaths. With a final, desperate blow, they shattered the altar, and the figure let out a blood-curdling scream. The cabin's walls began to collapse, and the ground beneath them opened up, revealing a fiery abyss. The friends clung to each other as the cabin crumbled around them. The figure reached out one last time, its claws grazing their skin before it was pulled into the abyss. As the cabin fell into the pit, the friends felt themselves being drawn down with it. But just as they were about to be swallowed by the darkness, a bright light enveloped them, and they were lifted out of the abyss. They awoke on the forest floor, the morning sun shining through the trees. The cabin was gone, and the forest was silent once more. Jessica and Mark stumbled back to the town, their minds reeling from the nightmare they had just survived. The townspeople were shocked to see them, as they had been missing for 3 days. They tried to explain what had happened, but no one believed them. The police searched the forest, but found no trace of the cabin or the ritual chamber. Haunted by the memories, Jessica and Mark left Briar Ridge, hoping to leave the horrors behind. But the nightmares followed them, and they could never escape the feeling that something was watching them. Years passed, and the friends tried to move on with their lives, but the pull of the cabin was too strong. One night, Jessica had a dream, a vision of the cabin, standing in the forest, waiting for them. She knew what she had to do. She called Mark, and together they returned to Briar Ridge, determined to end the curse once and for all. When they arrived at the forest, the path to the cabin was clear, as if it had been waiting for them. They entered the woods, their hearts heavy with dread. The cabin was exactly as they remembered it, untouched by time. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of decay, and the whispers returned louder than ever. But this time, they were ready. They had spent years researching, preparing for this moment. They had found a way to destroy the entity, but it would require both of them to complete the ritual. As they began the incantation, the figure reappeared, more terrifying than ever. It attacked, but the friends stood their ground, determined to finish what they had started. With the final words of the ritual, the cabin began to collapse around them. The ground shook, and the figure screamed in rage as it was pulled into the abyss once more. As the cabin crumbled, Jessica and Mark were consumed by the light. They felt the ground give way beneath them, and then there was nothing but darkness. When they awoke, they were lying on the forest floor, the morning sun shining through the trees. The cabin was gone, and the forest was silent once more. But this time, they knew it was truly over. The curse had been broken, and the entity was gone. They left the forest, never to return. But the memory of the cabin would haunt them forever, a reminder of the darkness that lurked just beneath the surface of the world. And as they walked away, they could still hear the faintest whisper in the wind, "Get out."